Oh, do we have a wild one to read up on today, including many of the main Linux maintainers, all over a currently drama-filled topic, which is using Rust in the Linux kernel, even leading to the resignation of a maintainer, and even talking about the endorsement of berating people on social media as the fix. This is going to be a long one. I'm going to go through a lot of reading in this current Rust and Linux drama, which caused Greg and Linus to have to step in, and even the Code of Conduct Committee to get called upon. Let's start it all off by reading where this all began. In the maintainers email list on the kernel lore website, we can see an email exchange that started it all. Again, this is a long one, but it's quite interesting as it brings in some of the questions. Talking about Linux governance and community dynamics, it's quite the read. So we start with this initial discussion about the DMA mapping helpers, which DMA is short for direct memory access. Add a simple DMA coherent allocator Rust abstraction based on Andreas Hinberg's DMA abstractions from the RNVMe driver, which was also based on an earlier work by Wedson Almeida Filo. Seamlessly no big deal, but this is what sparked things out. As a reply from one of the main maintainers of the DMA, Christoph says, "No Rust code in the kernel DMA, please." Quite an interesting and passionate response here, as this is what really kicks things off. The next thing is Miguel answering, "What do you suggest? Thanks. Cheers, Miguel." Well, the suggestion here is keep the wrappers in your own code instead of making life painful for others. Pretty two big hard hits, especially since Miguel is a very passionate Rust developer who's been doing great work when it comes to Rust in the Linux kernel. So this seemingly did not go over too well. What does your code mean? Duplicated in every driver? Otherwise, Rust kernel DMA.rs seems reasonable. No? Another response from Miguel to Christoph. And then Christoph responds to Danilo. Yes, interfaces in the DMA API should stay in readable C code and not in weird bindings so that it remains greppable and maintainable. I believe this word should be remains, but basically what they're saying is they want it to be searchable and maintainable. That's all that means. Again, throwing some shade at Rust and Linux, saying it's hard to follow basically because this code has all been written in C and seemingly they don't want to introduce another code base. It's not just Rust that they're complaining about here. I think if any other code base was introduced, Christoph would probably throw a fit here. Regardless, here's where things get lengthy. Danilo responds to Christoph, and in this exchange, we're not going to go through all of it because there's quite a lot and we still have a ton to get to, but I will remind you that we had another Rust maintainer step down not too long ago, citing non-technical nonsense in the Linux kernel, which ultimately led to their departure from the kernel. Wedson, a software engineer at Microsoft and who was a key maintainer of the Rust for Linux project, stepped down in August 2024 due to his frustration and basically cited the lack of energy to address any ongoing non-technical disputes. Well, this could be considered one, but rather interesting regardless. Rust drivers shouldn't use C APIs directly, but rather use an abstraction of corresponding C API. One reason for that is some requirements in C APIs naturally can be abstracted in a way that the Rust compiler already ensures certain things, and hence drivers have less potential to produce errors. Basically, Danilo's trying to explain how they can fix this Rust abstraction issue in the DMA API, but ultimately saying if you don't feel comfortable maintaining the Rust abstraction or just don't want to, that's fine. I don't think anyone expects you to do that. We can take care of that instead. By we, I believe they mean the rest of the Rust maintainers, only to be met by this answer here. Don't force me to deal with your shiny language of the day. Maintaining multi-language projects is a pain. I have no interest in dealing with it. If you want to use something that's not C, be that assembly or Rust, you write to C interfaces and deal with the impedance mismatch yourself as far as I'm concerned. Basically what Christoph is saying is they don't want the DMA code touched. Instead, the DMA exposes certain API features, which you can integrate code with, meaning there's already built-in functions that are all C-based that can communicate with the DMA, and that if they want to build code around the DMA, to use the API instead, meaning a whole separate Rust code base that would then call on the CDMA portion and then interface this way. Yes, it creates a layer of abstraction, but we can see how it helps the DMA because now they don't have to maintain any Rust code inside of here, which clearly Christoph is not about to do. Danilo says, again, no one asks you to deal with or maintain this piece of Rust code yourself. This is exactly what we're doing and proposing here, isn't it? We wrote a single piece of Rust code that abstracts the C API for all Rust drivers. which we offer to maintain ourselves. What are you asking for? And some other people step in saying, surely you can't expect the maintainers of Rust abstraction to help with integrating API changes. This isn't different compared to other drivers, components, maintainers helping with integrating fundamental API changes for their affected driver component, like you've mentioned before in video buff2 DMA stuff. At last year's LPC, I held a talk about Rust in the kernel, and there was a question at the end where I was asked how I think cases where Rust abstraction break cause C API changes. And the answer was people work together and collaborate. There are a lot of very core components that are widely used, and depending on the complexity of the change may require help of other users to integrate these changes. And that would be the strategy. An interesting strategy by Danilo. But Christoph remains standing his ground. No, I'm not. This was an explicit knack by Christoph Hellwig. And they take it a step further and just say, I don't want another maintainer. If you want to make Linux impossible to maintain due to cross-language code base, do that in your driver so that you have to do it instead of spreading this cancer to core subsystems, where this cancer explicitly is a cross-language code base and not Rust itself, just to escape the Flameware brigade. This is where things clearly start heating up. Basically, at this point, Christoph firmly says they don't want to introduce any other code in the DMA and even the kernel, including the core subsystems, because they don't want a cross-language code base to support. And they also specify not Rust itself. This is because they're already worried about people starting to brigade them about the fact that they don't like Rust itself. Well, that's not the truth. Their philosophy here is clearly one code base. No matter what language came up against this, it would have been shut down. Definitely a strong way to come in and reply to this email exchange. And this is where things start going quite haywire. I know you've been following along for quite a bit. Linus and Greg are about to get involved. But before they do, make sure to smash that like button for me if you enjoy content like this. Also, think about subscribing below. YouTube gets finicky and doesn't always get videos out to you unless you subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss another one. Let's get on to some of the juicy issues of core kernel development as well as open source. And that's simply people and the way that they communicate. This again is exchange from Danilo to Christoph. I accept that you don't want to be involved with Rust in the kernel. Again, I wouldn't just phrase it as Rust, any other code base besides C. Anyways, which is why we offered to maintain the Rust abstraction layer for the DMA coherent allocator as a separate component, which it would always be ourselves. Throughout this conversation, I did not see technical arguments or concerns against this, but I did recognize your opposition against Rust in the kernel and cross-language projects. So Danilo did separate these two. Again, cross-language projects is really the issue. But anyways, being a maintainer myself, I think it is outside the scope of a maintainer to restrict the usage of public kernel API for a certain entity arbitrarily and or by personal preference, which, as it appears to me, is the case here. All right, and here are where the big guns get summoned. Greg and Linus, I believe this would be on your peer view. So they're getting called out at this point. People are wanting them to chime in with this email exchange. And they will, but it's going to take a moment. As Christoph responds, which doesn't help me a bit. Every additional bit that another language creeps in drastically reduces the maintainability of the kernel as an integrated project. The only reason Linux managed to survive so long is not having internal boundaries, and adding another language completely breaks this. You might not like my answer, but I will do everything I can to stop this. This is not because I hate Rust. While not my favorite language, it's definitively one of the best new ones, and I encourage people to use it for new projects where it fits. I do not want it anywhere near a huge C code base that I need to maintain. Again, an absolutely strong stance by Christoph here. They do not want any other language in the kernel, and they're very against adding anything else but C in their particular code base to DMA, but we can see how this is getting people worked up. But what I want to make clear is we do see Danilo keep referring to Rust in the kernel. I think Christoph has made a point to say that it's not just Rust, and they keep going back to the fact that they actually like Rust, they just don't like it in the kernel because it's another language. So the focus here should be another language in the kernel, and that seemingly is what people should be focused on or arguing about, not necessarily Rust being the issue here, but we keep bringing it back to that. I've just been aware of it as I've been reading through the email chains. Something to keep in mind as we're going through this. Abdiel steps in and says, I do acknowledge your reservations about the possible maintenance burden due to the introduction of Rust or another language, consumer of the DMA API, but I was hoping that we could arrive at some sort of common ground. If this Rust middle layer abstraction is unacceptable to you, could you perhaps suggest a solution so that all the Rust device drivers don't end up with some redundant DMA coherent allocator Rust code? Could the Rust team do this something about it? Someone coming in to seemingly take things down a notch as things are getting heated. Christoph responds, the common ground is that I absolutely have no interest in helping to spread a multi-language code base. I absolutely support using Rust in a new code base, but I do not at all in Linux. Thank you for your understanding. Really stands their ground with this one, as the response is no, I don't want to work with another language. And we finally see Greg Crow-Hartman, referred to as Greg KH, who's a prominent Linux maintainer and developer, and really the successor to Linus at this point. He's responsible for the Linux stable releases and maintains several subsystems. So we can think of him as the second in command when it comes to Linux. And they step in responding to Jason, who asked for some sort of official statement to reassure the burden of keeping Rust abstractions working with any changes in C, and that it's not entirely on the Rust maintainer's shoulders. That's not the case. The one you point at above was a tooling issue that people missed due to the holidays. Fixing it up was simple enough, and people did so and moved on. Once a core API changes in a tree and it hits the Linux next and that blows up a Rust build, obviously people should notice it then, and the Rust maintainers developers have said they will fix it up. So the claim remains the same here. It's just like staging API. Changes to the subsystems are allowed to break staging, and Rust code and maintainers do not have to fix them up there. That's up to the staging and Rust maintainers and developers to do so. Thanks, Greg. And Greg replies once more, talking about Linus this time, from a recent event where Linus deferred the pull request and some C patches were dropped because of Rust K-build bugs. The message is crystal clear now, and the opposite of what you claim. All pull requests to Linus must not break the Rust build, and the responsibility for that falls to all the maintainers. It's really reading between the lines there, but Greg responds with, I cannot answer for Linus, sorry, but a generic, hey, this broke our working toolchain builds is something that is much, much, much different than an API change, so now I have to turn off this driver in my build issue. Thanks, Greg. Now we continue escalating, as then I think we need a clear statement from Linus and how it will be working, if he is to build testing Rust or not. Without that, I don't think the Rust team could be saying any changes on the C side rest entirely on the Rust side's shoulders. It is clearly not the process of Linus's build testing Rust and rejecting PRs that failed to build. Now Linus gets added to the conversation, adding Linus my 2 cents. If Linus doesn't pipe up with an authoritative answer to this thread, Miguel and the other Rust folks should just merge this series once it is reviewed and ready, ignoring Christoph's overt attempt at sabotaging the project. If Linus pulls it, what Christoph says doesn't matter. If Linus doesn't pull it, the Rust for Linux project is essentially dead until either Linus or Christoph make a move. Everything else is beating around the bush. Talking about a hostile takeover, this is just forcing the hand of Linus, and I just don't think this is a good approach. As we'll see, it took a while for Linus to respond to this because they were really trying to think on how to respond. Rust folks, please don't waste your time and mental cycles on drama like this. It's not worth your time. Either Linus likes it or he doesn't. Everything else is distractions orchestrated by a subset of saboteur maintainers who are trying to demoralize you until you have given up, because they know that you're going to be on the losing side of history sooner or later. No amount of sabotage from old entrenched maintainers is going to stop the world from moving on forwards towards a memory safe language or languages. And for what it's worth, in my opinion, the cancer comment from Christoph would be enough to qualify for a code of conduct action, but I doubt anything of sort will happen. This whole entire response is extremely inflammatory. I don't think it was necessary at all, and seems really weird coming from a maintainer, especially from the Rust space. I don't like how they're calling on the Code of Conduct Committee to do some action, and then just saying, well, I doubt anything would happen anyway. It just seems overtly melodramatic and doesn't really help with anything. And then calling for an authoritative answer, and then going into accusations of sabotage, the you versus them mentality, disregarding an established process, and even talking about the obsolescence of maintainers, especially in a project that's over 30 years old, doesn't make any sense to me. Such rhetoric just can escalate tensions, and I don't think that's what we needed in this pipeline and email exchange at this point. This was written by Hector, and we'll see soon how this escalates things. As the next person mentions, please don't hijack the side thread. This is about Linus's policy for merging C code that breaks Rust builds. you should not put the comment on the branch with Christoph's non-acknowledgement. Sorry for the thread mishap. It's kind of hard to redirect the other branch now though, Hector. And like I talked about at the beginning of the video, it is mentioned that there have already been high-profile departures from the Rust for Linux project due to the open hostility of certain kernel maintainers. The tension in the air is palpable, and so is lowering morale. I'm encouraging the people involved to stop playing nice and start playing hardball in these cases. Because playing nice does not work with some people, taking the high road only works with people who want to cooperate and reach such a solution that works for everyone. People who openly do not want to cooperate nor reach some sort of reasonable solution should be shunned and ignored, as is the case here, which I couldn't disagree more with. We need to let things play out. We still haven't got a response from Linus, and now we're calling for just going rogue and causing anarchy for the sake of it. Well, I don't know that that's the solution. Again, just a very weird back and forth at this point. I know this is only a few people with such strong, passionate beliefs, but it seems like we can't even wait for a resolution by the top down, waiting on Linus to give their answer or take away from all of this. But Hector continues on. What he is doing is quite literally the dictionary definition of sabotage, since his goal is to sabotage the Rust for Linux project. It's a fundamental goal. No amount of purely technical discussion will allow us to reach the workable solution. Therefore, the only possible reaction is social in nature. Ignore Christoph and work around him. Weird statement. I'm not going to comment too much on this one from Hector. And with another maintainer stepping in, Simona replies to the whole sabotage thing with just, yeah, no. And from a Mastodon post, this was about you because typing a proper answer takes a bit longer. It was also about your toots on Fetty like this. And haha, it's only a joke, doesn't work with your public profile and following. I do understand the frustration and temptation just to burn it all down to the ground, head the call of the sirens, or maybe me more to pick up go farming in the Swiss Alps, but you can't have it both and expect to be part of the contribution to the same community. And personally, I don't appreciate you getting drenched in gasoline while I'm trying to quench the flames on the ground. In the last part, they're just tired of dealing with this repeat behavior, seemingly from Hector, signed off, cheers, Sema. And then to back Sema up here, we don't need grandstanding, brigading, playing the crowd, streamer drama creation, or any of that in discussions around here. Well, it's not streamer drama creation, but I am discussing this here on YouTube. And that's definitely what happens with things like this. A lot of people who follow Linux will look at this drama and try to get an understanding of what actually is happening in the community. The Rust for Linux team and DRM maintainer team have this sort of thing in hand. It's not like we don't understand the community of the Linux kernel, and having this first reaction to blow shit up and dramatize it just isn't helpful. Being toxic on the right side of the argument is still toxic. Please try and be better, and maybe take a step back and consider what you are posting is going to help the discussion or just adding pointless drama to it. Dave. Wow. I told you this is going to be a long one, but it is important. As we get a post from Hector starting every sentence with "I'm tired." This is starting to feel much like we got with Wetson, who is tired of nonsensical nonsense and ultimately resigned as a Linux kernel maintainer who wrote Rust code. We'll go through a few of these, but at the end of this email is the important part to check out. I'm tired. I'm tired of seeing positive, technically impressive kernel projects blockaded, delayed by developers with no technical justification. I'm tired of seeing important contributors and maintainers give up. I'm tired of getting messages privately and publicly from all kinds of people saying that they won't touch the kernel with a 10-foot pole. I'm tired of seeing people get away with words like cancer to describe others' work with zero repercussion. I'm tired of politely and calmly calling out hostile and unwelcome behavior from maintainers. They're definitely tired, which, albeit, is completely understandable. And I'm tired of hearing things will get better if I just trust the process or let people work from within, while nothing seems to have actually changed in the years despite endless discussion about these problems on the sidelines. If shaming on social media does not work, then tell me what does, because I'm out of ideas. I just don't think this right here is a solution for anyone or anything. This is not to flame people on social media. It just doesn't make any sense. And it's not the point of this readout as well. This is just trying to show the discussion between maintainers, and just goes to show how hard it is to maintain something that is cross-language supported. There's clearly a technical and cultural divide here. Some of these developers in Rust see an ideological push, while others think the traditionalists, or the ones using C, are resistant to this modernization. They might not be necessarily resistant to the modernization, but they may be instead just worried about introducing new languages that will break their portion of the Linux kernel. Regardless, this never works, in my opinion, and is very inflammatory. Let's keep going as we finally get a response from Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux himself. If shaming on social media does not work, then tell me what does, because I'm out of ideas. How about you accept the fact that maybe the problem is you? Yikes. You think you know better, but the current process works. It has problems, but problems are a fact of life. There is no perfect. However, I will say that the social media brigading just makes me not want to have anything at all to do with your approach, which I personally agree with Linus here, because if we have issues in kernel development model, then social media sure as hell is not the solution. The same way it sure as hell wasn't the solution to politics. Technical patches and discussions matter. Social media brigading, no thank you. Linus. This is an important one to highlight just because, well, it's first off Linus giving their take on the whole situation for what we've seen the first time, and completely rejects the tactics of using social media and campaigns to influence the kernel development decisions, and talks about personal accountability and challenges Hector here on their own actions. And we really underscore the importance of adhering to the Linux kernel's established development process, not that it's broken. Of course, every system has its flaws, but it works well enough. Nothing is perfect. There is no perfect. I think this was really summed up well by Linus, and a great way to start de-escalating this whole entire thing. This all led to Hector, the lead developer of the Asahi Linux project, to resign from his role as an upstream maintainer in the Linux kernel's ARM code, well, for Apple Silicon. With initially calling for social media complaining, they then mentioned to Seema, since we're into complaining about the social media posts on the list now, I'm going to talk of one of yours. And they talk about a thread that came through and said, I will now proceed to F off, good luck. Hector, it's sad to see this back and forth on the Linux lore email list, as this all ultimately led to, I no longer have faith left in the Linux kernel development process or the community management approach. Apple ARM platform development will continue downstream. If I feel like sending some patches upstream in the future myself for whatever subtree I may or may not, anyone who feels like fighting the upstreaming fight themselves is welcome to do so. Signed off by Hector Martin, removing themselves as a maintainer. With the patch maintainers, remove myself. And these recent discussions within the Linux kernel community have definitely highlighted significant tensions regarding Rust and even introducing other code into the Linux kernel and adopting it. It's definitely notable as this proposed patch caught in the DMA or direct memory access faced a lot of opposition, mainly from the maintainer Christoph, who was concerned about the multi-language codebase and followed criticism by Hector and getting Greg and Linus Torvalds involved, which stand their ground in the importance of adhering to an established developmental process over external pressures like calling for the Code of Conduct Committee to do something about this, or even social media to do something about this. This whole thing underscores the broader challenges of balancing such a large project like the Linux kernel, and I think overall this should just be a lesson in trying to improve effective communication within the open source community, and that it's good that we had a talk like this. I mean, whether or not there is a broader struggle, it's always great to talk about these things and try to keep away from bringing in social dynamics into open source projects like this, where it just doesn't seemingly belong. Yes, this caused a lot of drama. Yes, a maintainer stepped down, but hopefully we've learned from this incident and can continue to improve from it. Well, I'm sure we'll continue to see some fallout from this whole exchange, but I want to know what you think about everything in the comment section below. What do you think about the entire approach here? I do feel like Hector was quite frustrated in many facets, not just the Rust for Linux deal, as they felt like they were getting brigaded by the entire community themselves. That can't be a good feeling, but the responses seemed a little bit out of touch, in my opinion. Love to hear from you, and if you made it this far, you're a true fan. Thank you for sticking around for so long. I hope you enjoyed things. Regardless, smash that like button for me for making it this far. And don't forget to subscribe below. You wouldn't want to miss another video like this. Catch me in a great community on Discord, and I'll catch you in another video. Thanks for watching. Linux can be hard to understand, but I take the most commonly used terms, commands, and subjects in Linux, and I break them down into simple to read documents, including Linux terms, flashcards, a checklist, a cheat sheet, and a mind map. And if you're ready to level up your Linux experience and knowledge, go to SavvyNik.com now and get access to these sheets.